The subcommittee on border security, facilitation, and operations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting to hear stakeholder perspectives on addressing unaccompanied children at the U.S.-Mexico border. The challenge posed by children arriving at our border is not new. Unaccompanied children from Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere have long sought refuge in the U.S. This is also not the first time we have seen increased numbers of unaccompanied children at our southern border. There were similar increases in 2014 and 2019. Northern Triangle countries suffer from unspeakable violence, corruption, and poverty. Last November, the region was hit by two devastating hurricanes that destroyed homes and wiped out critical infrastructure, worsening the situation and prompting more desperate families and children to flee. Migrant children are undertaking the arduous, dangerous journey because conditions at home are so dire. Many hope to reunite with family living in the United States. Like many of my colleagues, this breaks my heart, seeing them waiting to be reunited. The increased number of child migrants is certainly a challenge, but the U.S. government must provide these children with protections guaranteed to them under law. These protections ensure that children are quickly transferred from Customs and Border Protection, CBP, custody, from there into the Department of Homeland Security, or HHS, which is much better equipped to handle these children and get care for them, as well as unite them with their families or sponsors. The Biden administration is rapidly building capacity to provide proper care for migrant children after President Trump dismantled the system. I have heard a number of my colleagues urge the current administration to reimpose policies incredibly harmful to children, particularly unaccompanied children, like expelling kids under Title 42. Under Title 42, the Trump administration sent young children back to the very dangerous conditions they are fleeing, scared and alone. This is unconscionable, and we cannot go back. Under the last administration, the Department of Homeland Security also neglected to prepare for an increase in migration that was long predicted. DHS saw the warning signs in mid-2020 of another increase. It chose not to build the capacity needed to process and care for vulnerable migrants. Now is not the time to score political points. We must work together to improve our asylum system and border policies, and do so respecting the humanity and unique needs of child migrants. I am encouraged that President Biden committed to reinstitute humane border policies. The law requires we treat unaccompanied children humanely and allows children to apply for asylum. It is simply the right thing to do legally and morally. Like many members, I recently traveled to the Rio Grande Valley to conduct an oversight visit. I toured the Donna processing facility where many of the children are held until they are transferred to HHS care. I spoke to little girls from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, girls who looked just like I did at their age. While CBP processing facilities are no place for children, the facility conditions have improved tremendously compared to what I saw under the previous administration. No doubt, there is still more to be done. For example, I met too many children that did not know they could use the phone to call their families. The number of kids in Border Patrol custody has fallen dramatically in recent weeks, and the average time for children in custody is now well under the 72-hour threshold mandated by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. This is due in large part to the stand-up of new emergency intake sites and influx care facilities to facilitate and expedite the movement of children out of the hands of Border Patrol and into the custody of child welfare specialists. In fact, HHS has opened an emergency intake site at the Long Beach Convention Center, just outside my district here in California. I am pleased to be joined today by the mayor of Long Beach to discuss that effort. My district does include North Long Beach, and I am proud to represent such a welcoming community and work with a leader like Mayor Garcia. The progress we have seen over the last few weeks are initial steps to improve conditions and the process addressing children at our border. Federal agencies are not alone in providing care to unaccompanied minors. Rather, this is a whole community approach where civil society, service care providers, pro bono lawyers, NGOs, and many others supplement the efforts of the federal government. Protecting vulnerable children is an American value, and I look forward to hearing the witnesses' perspectives on the administration's response and recommendations on how to move forward from here. And with that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Higgins of Louisiana, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. We have difficult ground to cover, and we're going to discuss some uncomfortable things, but I'd like to say at the outset that I have a personal conviction regarding our chairwoman's compassionate determination to seek a path forward. And I have faith that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle um, can can come together to move forward to find real solutions, despite the fact that we will have difficult conversations because it's a tough subject. There's a crisis on our southwest border with no end in sight. That's reality. The administration's campaign statements, coupled with what I believe to be an overzealous renunciation of the prior administration's border policies, which had proven to be effective ultimately. I believe these circumstances have invited this activity to our border. Specifically, the suspension of wall system construction was a major error. The remain in Mexico policy should be reinstated. Asylum cooperative agreements should be continued and enhanced. Some of these policies, coupled with the enabling of the catch and release practice, restricting immigration enforcement, and the refusal to equally apply Title 42 across the board, these decisions have exacerbated the crisis at the border. The Secretary of Homeland himself stated that we're on track to see the highest number of illegal crossings in over 20 years. However, no one in the current administration has stepped forward to really take a leadership role to deal with this crisis. The border coordinator is leaving after 3 months on a job. The vice president has yet to publicly engage at the border and visit the border. Secretary Mayorkas continues to, in my opinion, ignore legitimate information requests from this oversight body about the operational realities on the ground. Now, in good faith, perhaps they're working on it, but he has not provided many answers to the questions we've submitted. Last month, Customs and Border Protection encounters surpassed 172,000 at the southwest border. And we all know that that's a percentage of the actual crossings because we never touch 100%. That's reality. So the truth is the number was greater than 172,000 if you're looking for the number of actual illegal crossings. The administration continues to claim that single adults and family units are being expelled under Title 42 Public Health Emergency Authority. However, DHS's own statistics show this to be false. In March, only 60% were denied entry. Border Patrol facilities and temporary processing centers, the same ones used by the Trump administration, remain over capacity. My colleagues, respectfully, on the other side of the aisle, slammed conditions in 2019 and now referring to the same facilities under the Biden administration as more humane. May I argue that more crowded does not equal more humane? This is just another example of the incredible things that happen in the bizarre realm of DC. This this subcommittee and the committee as a whole must have the courage to honestly engage and to find solutions because the American peoples see through political posturing. A new Washington Post ABC News poll shows that a majority of Americans disapprove of the Biden administration's handling of the situation at the southwest border. That's that's just reality. Less than 20% of the crossings make a credible fear claim. Now, this is important to note because that's the first step in the process for asylum at the land border. Now, this doesn't mean that Moore didn't seek it as a defense against removal later on, but we should not state or suggest that everyone at the border is seeking asylum, because that's just not true, and we know that to be not true. We must push through the political posturing and seek truth and resolution to these situations. The Biden administration decision to use prosecutorial discretion in the RGV sector, the Rio Grande Valley sector, most people are not able to be immediately expelled or released en masse. Some without ever being entered into removal proceedings. Border Patrol agents on the ground told us and told me that the federal government has become the largest facilitator of human smuggling at the border. That's the perception of the boots on the ground, largely when you talk to those guys, that their law enforcement mission has been transformed into facilitators of illegal crossings. That should be a wake up call for Congress, and we should work together again towards solutions. Another persistent issue at our border concerns the activities of TCOs, the cartels. Months old babies and toddlers don't just appear at the southwest border on their own. They're smuggled to our borders by, by cartels who don't care about their safety or well being, and they're not hydrated properly or fed properly. And if it, or if the adult holding them is related to them, that's very much in question. TCOs, they only care about cash. The cartels are making American cash dollars hand over fist. There have been reports of smugglers throwing toddlers in the Rio Grande River to distract Border Patrol. We've all seen the footage of smugglers dropping toddlers over the wall. It's horrific what they're doing, and that's where we should be focused on how to combat these cartels, the pipeline that is feeding the illegal crossings into our southern border. The best practices of treating children at the border, we'll hear today, doesn't matter to the cartels. Every child they smuggle or use to distract from their loads of drugs and sex trafficking makes them more emboldened. Criminal cartels are profiting at an unprecedented level from this administration's policies. That's not to mean that my colleagues on this committee don't have compassionate hearts in the right place. I'm just saying we have to admit that this administration's policies are not working. We have to communicate with the Biden administration effectively and encourage real solutions. The decision not to expel unaccompanied minors is causing some parents to make the decision to self-separate. We've heard from Customs and Border Protection that they've encountered many adults claiming to be children at the border in hopes of not being expelled. I don't have to explain the dangers of putting unrelated adults in facilities with children. It's a recipe for disaster, and indeed it's happening. There are at least 3 facilities that house unaccompanied minors with serious outstanding allegations of misconduct just in the last month. One shuttered overnight with reports of children being forced in untenable positions with no toilets available. The administration's failure to properly address the border crisis endangers our republic. Bottom line, failure to take the decisive action will have an immeasurable, lasting consequence. Inaction in the name of political expediency is not acceptable. I know my chairwoman's heart is in the right place. I have faith we can come together. Madam Chairwoman, thank you for your consideration, and I yield.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Members are reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines set out by the Chairman and Ranking Member in their July 8th colloquy. The Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Good afternoon. I thank Chairwoman Barragon for holding today's hearing on unaccompanied children at the southern border and for leadership on this important issue. Despite some of the rhetoric about the situation at the southern border, this challenge is not new. We've seen increased arrivals of unaccompanied children and others at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2014, 2018, 2019, and more in previous decades. When there was a surge of families and children at the border in 2018, President Trump tore children from their parents. In 2019, President Trump instituted a series of anti-immigrant policies that failed to address the root causes of increased migration, caused thousands of children to languish in government custody, and squandered millions on projects that failed to secure the border. In 2020, when arrivals started trending upwards, rather than preparing to address the situation, the Trump administration continued dismantling our immigration infrastructure and began expelling unaccompanied children into Mexico alone instead of allowing them to seek protection provided for under the law. Instead, the Biden administration is responding to the challenge by treating children humanely and working to fix the underlying causes of this situation. Federal agencies are working closely with local communities to provide temporary shelter and COVID-19 testing for the vulnerable children. The Biden administration is also working with non-governmental organizations like Kids in Need of Defense to provide and connect unaccompanied children with legal services, essential medical care, and educational opportunities. All of these efforts are designed to get kids out of CBP facilities and quickly reunite them with their families. The administration is also restarting the Central American Minors Program to allow unaccompanied children to apply for protection in their home country and make a safe, orderly journey to the U.S. if they qualify. These are real actions taken to hopefully address one of the many factors pushing children to make the dangerous journey to our border. Last week, former Trump advisor Stephen Miller's organization filed its first lawsuit to force the Biden administration to begin expelling vulnerable, unaccompanied children to Mexico again. It is simply unconscionable that some would try to bring back the Trump administration's inhumane policy of returning vulnerable children back to the dangerous conditions they fled. Returning to inhumane policies toward children should be a non-starter. Border security is a priority for this committee and the Biden administration, but we also must not lose focus on other issues like domestic terrorism and critical infrastructure protection. We also do not have to sacrifice border security to treat vulnerable unaccompanied children with basic decency. We can do both. Secretary Mayorkas and the men and women of DHS have made good progress in addressing the situation at the border, but we still have a long road to really and fully repair this system. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today on possible ways Congress and administration can help address this ongoing challenge in the short and long term while continuing to uphold our values as a nation. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not seeing the ranking member full committee, we will proceed on to our witnesses. I now have the pleasure of welcoming our panel of witnesses. First, we have Mr. Aaron Reichlin Melnick, is Policy Counsel at the American Immigration Council, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that examines the American immigration system. Mr. Reichlin Melnick works primarily on immigration court issues and the intersection of immigration law and policy. Dr. Robert Garcia is an educator and the 28th mayor of Long Beach, California. He strongly supports comprehensive immigration reform and leads a community that welcomes immigrants. As mayor, he worked with the Long Beach City Council, HHS, FEMA, and local NGOs and advocates to lease the Long Beach Convention Center as an emergency intake site for migrant children. Our next witness, Jennifer Podkol, is Vice President for Policy and Advocacy from Kids in Need of Defense, or KIND, an NGO devoted to the protection of unaccompanied and separated children. Ms. Podkol is an international human rights lawyer and a national expert on issues affecting immigrant children. Laura Reese, our next witness, is Director of the Center for Technology Policy and Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to her current position, she served in various positions at the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration as a lobbyist for Homeland Security contractors and as counsel on the Judiciary Committee. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Reichlin Melnick.
Chairwoman Barragan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the committee and subcommittee. My name is Aaron Reichlin Melnick, and I'm Policy Counsel at the American Immigration Council, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to ensuring that the United States provides a fair process for all immigrants, including those seeking protection. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak today to provide some perspective on unaccompanied children at the border, and to emphasize that the challenge we face today is not about reducing numbers, but about resolving long-standing deficiencies in our humanitarian processing system. From the 1980s through the 2000s, the Border Patrol routinely apprehended upwards of 100,000 children a year. Concerns about their treatment led to protections for migrant children, which were expanded on a bipartisan basis in the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. Congress declared that the goal of the TVPRA was, quote, preventing the trafficking of unaccompanied children found in the United States by ensuring that they are not repatriated into the hands of traffickers or abusive families and are well cared for. This goal of ensuring that children are not deported into abusive conditions got its first big test in 2014. Tens of thousands of unaccompanied children and families came to our borders and sought protection, making headlines and revealing an ill-equipped and outdated humanitarian protection system. So what happened when those children when the media spotlight went away? Well, recently published Department of Homeland Security data reveals a key truth. Most won their cases. Since 2013, 57% of unaccompanied children with completed court cases have been granted the right to stay. This vital fact underscores the dire conditions from which children are fleeing. That brings us to today. After the pandemic hit, the Trump administration began expelling all migrants under a policy known as Title 42, regardless of whether they were asylum seekers or unaccompanied children, and even if they had tested negative for COVID-19, CBP expelled them to Mexico or deported them to their home countries alone. Despite Title 42, the number of people coming to the border has been rising steadily since last spring. By September of last year, border apprehensions were already at levels not seen in 15 years, driven primarily by large numbers of single adults being apprehended and expelled multiple times, as well as people's inability to obtain safety while waiting at the border. The number of unaccompanied children also kept rising. In total, nearly 16,000 unaccompanied children were expelled under Title 42 before a judge blocked the practice last November as illegal. And by December, shelters for unaccompanied children were already at 67% capacity. So when the steady increases accelerated in January, all remaining bed space quickly filled up and a bottleneck formed at the border, leading to unacceptably high numbers of children locked in overcrowded Border Patrol cells for days or weeks at a time, just as we saw in 2014 and 2019. In response, the Biden administration began standing up a network of emergency shelters to clear the bottleneck. And over the last month, this effort has paid off. The number of children in Border Patrol custody has dropped 80% since late March, and as of this morning, the average time in Border Patrol custody for unaccompanied children is below 48 hours. However, unlicensed emergency influx shelters must not become the new norm. Migrant children belong in the care of family and loved ones, not the government, which is why the focus now is on getting children out of shelters more quickly. Thankfully, here as well, the Biden administration's efforts have begun to pay off. Last Thursday, for the first time since reporting began, more children left U.S. custody than entered it. Despite claims to the contrary, the U.S. border is not open. The ports of entry remain closed to those seeking asylum, and more than 40,000 families have been expelled back to Mexico since January. Some of those parents, faced with the dangers of waiting in Mexico and the impossibility of returning to the violence they fled, have made the agonizing decision to send their children across the border alone. These self-separations will undoubtedly continue until the Biden administration ends Title 42. Today, we are seeing once again how decades of deterrence-based policies have not worked. The primary goal moving forward should not be reducing numbers. Instead, it should be to build a fair, efficient, and above all, safe system for those seeking our help, whether single adults, families, or unaccompanied children. We have been here before, and we will be here again unless we invest in a robust humanitarian protection system, one which can respond flexibly to extraordinary migration events. The American Immigration Council looks forward to helping work with the committee on these solutions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. With that, I would now move to recognize Mayor Robert Garcia to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon, Chairwoman Barragan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Robert Garcia. I'm the mayor of Long Beach, California, and I'm here today to address the subcommittee about our city supporting what is really a humanitarian mission, and that's establishing a federal migrant shelter here at the Long Beach Convention Center. Now, Long Beach is approximately home to about 500,000 people of all backgrounds. We're in Southern California, and we have a rich history of welcoming immigrants from around the world, in particular Cambodian refugees that fled persecution. Now, my personal history is also one of an immigrant. I came to this country when I was 5 years old from Peru, and under different circumstances, but still poor and without many services. I became a US citizen when I was 21. It was the proudest day of my life. So I come to the subcommittee with the lived experience of an immigrant also seeking a better life. Now, the Long Beach Convention Center is currently set up to host a total of 1,000 migrant children at any time from 5 to 17. And I want to be very clear, these facilities should be temporary and the goal should be quick family reunification. Now, the city's role in this humanitarian effort is to provide the facility and to connect HHS with local service providers while HHS operates the site. The goal is quick family reunification, and our temporary shelter is through August 2nd, 2021. Now, every child that comes to the Long Beach facility is provided with the best of care. HHS is very dedicated to this. These children are welcomed, and we're grateful that they are shown kindness similar to other immigrants, and even myself when I came to the US, from many people from around the community. These children are provided 3 meals a day with snacks prepared by our convention center staff. Classrooms are set up. They get education for multiple hours a day from folks from around the community and the surrounding area. Now, the Long Beach facility also offers outdoor space and activities for children to enjoy. There are indoor recreational activities and outdoor, including books, video games, and movies. Important services are being provided by HHS and partner agencies to every child, most importantly, medical service. UCLA Medical Center actually has a full-size clinic with diagnostic and immediate care that is provided. The utmost care to each child's needs is being met within the center. In addition, there's other services, social workers, mental health care, legal representation, and resources to manage their needs. We've tried to pair also our HHS partners with local organizations that help in this endeavor to make the Long Beach shelter as much of a success as possible. Now, it's important to note that these children have come from the border. Most arrive alone without parents or family, and bringing them to shelters like ours is certainly more humane than leaving them at the border. Now, HHS is focused on quick family reunification. And it's important to note that temporary sites like the Long Beach Convention Center are necessitated by this humanitarian mission, but these sites should not replace immigration reforms. Now, it breaks my heart that we have an immigration system that is broken. It's been decades since we've had any type of immigration reform, and strong immigration reform and investments to our neighbors, humanitarian missions, and diplomacy are needed to address current migration of children and others. Now, central to any immigration reform effort, as we all know, must be a clear and fair pathway for citizenship for all those that are undocumented in this country. That includes support for dreamers and those in the military that should go to the front of the line, and a strong guest worker program that must be developed with support of our neighboring countries. And we must provide additional aid to support to Mexico and Central American countries. Now, these reforms are not only necessary, but would be transformational to our economy, national security, and millions of families. But we must also expand resources for asylum seekers so that the unaccompanied children at the border have access to legal counsel, interpretation, and other critical services. We should be looking at rescinding Title 42 and fully restoring access to asylum at our borders. We must ensure that children are not held at border facilities, which honestly are no place for children. We need to care for children in facilities that are scaled to meet their needs, and we must partner with local agencies on the ground to help get resources as fast as possible to these children. Now, our top priority should be to address the underlying reasons why these temporary facilities are needed in the first place. With additional resources and immigration reform efforts, we can prevent the need for these types of shelters, period. Now, I want to thank you for welcoming me to address this subcommittee. We're grateful to be able to help in this humanitarian mission, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mayor Garcia, much appreciated. And now we will move on to our next witness. I'd like to recognize Ms. Podpool to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Barragan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Jennifer Podpool. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Kids in Need of Defense. KIND is the preeminent US-based non-governmental organization devoted to protection of unaccompanied and separated children. KIND envisions a world in which every unaccompanied child on the move has access to legal counsel and has their rights and well-being protected as they migrate alone in search of safety. Since its inception, KIND has received referrals from more than 21,000 cases and now serves over 5,000 children annually. I'm grateful the subcommittee is holding today's hearing to explore the ways we can transform our protection system into one that fully upholds children's rights and well-being as they migrate alone in search of safety. There have been high numbers of children, both unaccompanied as well as those traveling with their parents or legal guardians, coming to our border asking for protection for almost a decade. This has been due to the perpetually high levels of violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, abuse, and impunity that have devastated many countries in Central America. These dangers have only been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and 2 recent devastating hurricanes. Despite many attempts by prior administrations to deter kids from making the journey and seeking protection in the United States, they've continued to flee here. This is because you can't deter away a refugee situation. Not only have the drivers of migration worsened, but the use of Title 42 authority against children in violation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act created an artificial buildup of kids languishing in northern Mexico who've had no choice but to request protection again. Thousands of children were simply told the US was closed for business, and then they were summarily dumped on the other side of the border with no concern for their safety, exposing them to a heightened risk of trafficking or other grave harm. For example, 3 children between the ages of 3 and 9 who were traveling with their mother to the US-Mexico border. Tragically, the mother died, and when the children were orphaned, they were taken in by the taxi driver who drove the mother to the hospital. They lived with this stranger until they were finally allowed to present to US officials. Each child asking for protection at the border has a story. Too many have suffered this kind of unimaginable trauma, which has brought them to our doorstep. The Biden administration has already made important strides in restoring access to protection and due process for unaccompanied children. They've put policies in place to expedite reunification so children do not needlessly languish in government custody, such as eliminating the information sharing agreement between DHS and HHS and streamlining sponsor requirements. They're restarting the Central American Minors Program to allow children to apply for protection closer to their country of origin so that some may not even have to make the dangerous journey. And finally, they've made a commitment to investing in sending countries to finally address the root causes of migration so that children never have to leave their homes. These initial commitments will go a long way. However, we need systematic change that will ensure we are not here time and again having to scramble to put children in unlicensed makeshift facilities and to make sure children do not have to wait years for the resolution of their applications for humanitarian relief. We need to establish a fundamentally humanitarian reception model at the border that includes CBP hiring child welfare professionals to screen and care for children, and having HHS staff co-located at the reception centers to expedite the transfer of children to licensed facilities and expedite family reunifications. ORR must move away from running influx facilities and instead expand capacity in family-based and small-scale shelters that can be more responsive to migration trends. Finally, we need to ensure children's cases are considered fairly and efficiently, and that a child always has an attorney to support them through the complex process. We all win when we do right by these kids. Let me just close with a quote from a kind client who joined the US Marines after winning his asylum case. He said, "I will always be deeply grateful for those who helped me along the way. I am only here now because of them, and I pledge to help others as this country has helped me. I will defend the values of freedom, liberty, and justice for all, as only one who has been denied those fundamental rights can." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Podkul, for your testimony today. And it's great to hear those stories. I now like to recognize our next witness, Ms. Reese, to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Barragan and Ranking Member Higgins, for the opportunity to speak to you today about the current border crisis. My name is Laura Reese, and I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Homeland Security at the Heritage Foundation. The views expressed here are my own and do not reflect an institutional position for the Heritage Foundation or its Board of Trustees. We are witnessing record numbers of unaccompanied alien children, or UACs, at our southern border. In March, nearly 19,000 UACs were encountered by CBP. In contrast, CBP encountered only 741 UACs in April of 2020. This staggering increase has been driven by messaging and policy choices that have endangered lives and knowingly enriched traffickers and smugglers. In February, border traffickers reportedly were making $14 million a day. Instead, the U.S. should have policies that prevent illegal immigration and encourage lawful immigration. How did we get here? The 2000 Unaccompanied Alien Child Protection Act. Its purpose was the permanent protection of UACs. It offered them easier and expanded immigration benefits, including prompt parole into the U.S., taxpayer-funded guardians ad litem and attorneys, special immigrant juvenile visas, an easier adjustment of status process, and exemption from expedited removal. It was easy to predict that more parents would send their children unaccompanied to the border to take advantage of these benefits. The bill ultimately passed in the 2008 Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPRA. That bill states, to prevent trafficking in persons, the U.S. shall ensure that UACs in the U.S. are safely repatriated to their country of nationality or of last habitual residence. But the law then distinguishes between processing UACs from contiguous countries who are generally returned to their country and those from elsewhere. For UACs from non-contiguous countries, the law requires they be placed into U.S. removal proceedings and receive the benefits described above. Predictably, the number of UACs steadily increased in the years that followed. In 2010, CBP encountered 18,400 UACs. That number grew to 24,400 in 2012, and after DACA was started, UACs soon spiked to over 68,500 in 2014. The makeup of contiguous nationals as compared to non-contiguous nationals also changed. In 2009, children from Mexico accounted for 82% of the UAC apprehensions at the border, while those from Northern Triangle countries accounted for 17%. By 2019, those proportions had flipped. Another important pull factor for illegal immigration is limited immigration detention and mandatory release into the U.S. Flores, a settlement agreement on detention standards for unaccompanied minors, has been expanded. And when a single district judge ruled that unaccompanied and accompanied children must be released from detention within 20 days. Because removal proceedings are not completed within 20 days, ICE releases UACs and family units into American communities to comply with Flores. We experienced a border crisis in 2019 when CBP encountered over 76,000 UACs and 527 family units. The Trump administration implored Congress to close its TVPRA, UAC, and Flores loopholes to stop the flow of UACs and family units, but Congress refused to do so. With the migrant protection protocols and negotiated asylum cooperative agreements with the Northern Triangle countries, the numbers of illegal immigrants decreased because would-be migrants learned that they would not get into the US and would be sent back. With campaign promises to end such enforcement measures and to provide amnesty, smugglers encouraged more immigrants to make the journey north in anticipation of Joe Biden's election. The new administration then quickly ended the Trump administration's enforcement measures and agreements, resulting in a more rapid increase in illegal immigration to now historic numbers. If leaders want to prevent smuggling and trafficking of children and restore order to our border and immigration system, Congress and the administration should prevent illegal immigration by enforcing current laws and removing incentives to come here unlawfully. This includes resuming MPP, returning to the terms of the asylum cooperative agreements, completing the planned border wall construction, treating all non-contiguous nationals the same as contiguous nationals, removing benefits based on being a UAC, returning to the 1997 terms of the Flores Settlement Agreement, rescinding the February 2021 ICE Priorities Memo, ending catch and release, rejecting amnesty for those who broke our immigration laws, and applying the proper definition of UAC as defined in the Homeland Security Act. This concludes my statement, and I will respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank the witness for her testimony. I want to thank every witness for their testimony, and I will remind the subcommittee that we will have 5 minutes each to ask questions of the panel. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, and then we will alternate between sides until we get through everybody. And if there's an opportunity, maybe we'll have a second round depending on our timing. And so with that, I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Reichlin Melnick, I want to start with you. As an approach to deter irregular migration, President Trump created and implemented the family separation policy, tearing thousands of families apart. After rescinding this awful practice, he implemented more harmful policies, such as the Migrant Protection Protocols, Title 42, and metering to deny access to asylum. How would you describe the effect of the Trump-era border policies in slowing migration at the southern border?
I think what we saw with the Trump administration policies such as MPP or Remain in Mexico and the so-called asylum cooperative agreements is that those programs fundamentally did not work. They sent tens of thousands of people into danger, sending them to a kidnapper's paradise in Mexico. It is possible that as many as 1 in 10 people sent back to Mexico under MPP were subject to kidnappings, assaults, or other violent acts by the cartels. So in effect, under MPP and as well under Title 42, families are being turned over into the hands of the cartels and pushed into desperation. And I also want to make clear that the asylum cooperative agreements have been suspended since last year, and fewer than 1,000 people were ever sent to Guatemala under those agreements. The Biden administration terminating those agreements had absolutely no effect on the border. Similarly, terminating MPP had very little effect, as just 1.2% of people have been subject to MPP since Title 42 began.
Thank you. Mayor Garcia, I'm so proud that our community is stepping forward to help care for some of the vulnerable children arriving at the southwest border. As you know, these are children, they're scared and they're alone, who've fled unthinkable dangers and shocking conditions. Last Thursday, the Long Beach Convention Center opened its doors to young girls and boys seeking safety in the United States. Can you tell us more about the process for establishing an emergency intake site at the Long Beach Convention Center?
Sure thing. We, of course, were reached out by the administration to see if we would be interested in hosting this emergency shelter. Long Beach, with its history of kind of compassionate, viewpoint with refugees and with immigrants, brought it forward to the Long Beach City Council, which voted unanimously to move it forward. And then, of course, our city team got into many meetings with our partners over at HHS as well as FEMA. They toured the site before the children came multiple times. They brought in a full medical team and doctors to ensure the site was safe. And they brought also a bunch of social services on site. One thing that was really, I think, important for us in the community, as we talked to folks, that this would be a temporary site because we believe in family reunification and how that must be the goal, was that every child that arrives also has legal counsel. So there is actually an organization called Immigrant Defenders who are well respected, within here in the state and the country. They're providing each child with advice and legal counsel through that process as well. And so HHS has really done a great job of bringing resources in on the ground.
Fantastic. I'd like to have the clerk post chart A, a chart that was provided by our witness, Reichlin Meltnick. This question is for you, Mr. Reichlin Meltnick. I apologize. I have 5 minutes, so we're trying to get through what we can here. I thought this was a really helpful and informative chart that you provided the committee. When I look at the data, I see that more migrants were processed into the United States in 2019 than what we are seeing now. We keep hearing from folks on the other side of the aisle that there's an open border policy, anybody can come. Can you please tell us if this chart helps debunk the narrative that the President Biden has an open border policy, and what other key takeaways can we take from this data in your chart?
Thank you. I think this chart makes clear that fewer people are getting into the border today than were in 2019 under the Trump administration. The Biden administration has expelled tens of thousands of families back to Mexico. So even though, and there are fewer families coming to the border today than there are under President Trump in 2019. So as a result, because about a third of all families right now are being sent back to Mexico, significantly fewer families are being allowed to access asylum under the Biden administration than were allowed to access the asylum process under the Trump administration.
Fantastic. And if the clerk can remove the chart here, we can. I can also take a look at the timer. And I see that my time is expiring, so hopefully we do get into this second round of questions so that we can definitely hear from more and more of our witnesses. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the ranking member for his 5 minutes of question. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding legal immigration, legal residency, and the pathway to citizenship in America, let me say that our nation is a compassionate and generous country with arguably the most receptive and accessible immigration policies of any prominent sovereign nation anywhere in the world. Myself and my conservative colleagues, we encourage legal immigration, and we refer to the simple fact that America is a very generous nation. I challenge you to find another that is a prosperous world power with an immigration policy as receptive as our own. Ms. Reese, let's talk about some of the policy issues you have articulated regarding in your statement regarding immigration loopholes and policies that have led to the unprecedented volume of unaccompanied minors we're seeing at the southwest border right now. The Biden administration has announced plans to spend $4 billion of American treasure on foreign aid to address quote unquote root causes, but that still leaves us with the legal and policy gaps that you've laid out. In your opinion, what do we do first? I believe we should secure the border and end these policies that are pull factors. What do you advise Congress should be working on right now to address Flores and TVPRA loopholes?
Thank you. So the first thing that needs to be done is to stop the pull factors and stop putting children into the arms of smugglers and traffickers. And that comes about a few different ways. One is in TVPRA treating nationals from Mexico and Canada different than other countries. Even President Obama himself had asked that this loophole be fixed during the 2014 crisis that he and then Vice President Biden had fixed. In addition, changing the Flores ruling by a single U.S. District Court judge, where she declared that not only would accompanied children, in addition to unaccompanied children, be released, but they be released within 20 days. Everyone agrees that removal proceedings should happen more quickly. DHS has also shown that when aliens are detained during those removal proceedings, that a high percentage, 98% of those folks are removed if they're not eligible for relief. And so the Homeland Security Advisory Committee in 2019 had concluded that there was a gross inadequate amount of detention space for family units. And so that needs to be changed as well.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that. I look forward to speaking with you further about it. I introduced legislation last week to finish the sections of the wall system that were already appropriated for or obligated prior to the Biden administration's suspension of construction. Would you share with America if you recognize the legitimate deterrence of a 21st century wall system and the completion of those sections, how important it are? These sections have been requested by Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol. Do you support that legislation, and do you recognize a wall as a deterrent?
The planned wall construction should be completed. Border Patrol agents have long said they need three things. They need personnel, they need technology, and they need infrastructure. And the wall system, it's not just the wall, it's the access road, it's the cameras, the sensors, et cetera, is a key part of that. It buys them time, it gives them awareness of what's happening on the border. Congress has appropriated that money, and so it should be completed as planned.
I agree. Madam Chair, I can't see the clock right now. How much
23
time I have
seconds.
remaining. I have one further question for Ms.
23
Reese.
seconds.
Ms. Reese, thank you, ma'am. Ms. Reese, would you address the accusations that the Trump administration essentially dismantled the asylum system? I don't believe that's accurate.
It's incorrect. I mean, if you measure asylum in terms of grants, the Trump administration granted more asylum cases in its first 3 years than the highest 4 years during the Obama administration of an 8-year term, 2 terms. What the Trump administration went after was fraud in asylum and fraudulently using the generous program of asylum to come to the U.S. and to remain here indefinitely.
Exactly. Thank you for that clarification, Madam Chair. Thank you for your consideration. I yield.
Thank you. TV, PRA, and Flores aren't gaps. They're protections that Congress and the courts have put in place to protect vulnerable children. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. And with that, I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes. Well, let me back up for a quick second. I'm going to get ahead of myself. The chair will recognize other members for questions that they may wish to ask the witnesses. As previously outlined, I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning. And with that, I now have the pleasure and the honor of recognizing the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Thompson from Mississippi. Mr. Chairman, I believe you're still on mute. We still have a hard time hearing you. Okay, Mr. Thompson, we still can't hear you. Maybe we can have somebody take a look at your technical issues, and we will move to our next Democratic colleague for the moment. And I see that we have Representative Correa. Mr. Correa, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
We
Can you
hear
hear
you
me?
loud and clear.
Yes? Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this most important hearing. Having children, unaccompanied children in harm's way is never something to be taken lightly. I, like you, have gone to El Paso, Texas. I've had the opportunity to speak to those children in their language. And also had the opportunity to meet Yuri and Yareli, the 2-year-old and the 5-year-old girls that were thrown over the border by the smugglers. And if it wasn't for the Border Patrol that actually saw them, those young ladies would have perished in the middle of the desert. Now, I've also had the opportunity to visit deported families in Tijuana, Mexico, deported under Title 42 of the Health Code. And as I was sitting there looking at these families, looking at these children, I'm reminded that this is nothing new. In 2008, I also had the opportunity to visit similar places with children, similar faces, similar circumstances in California. This issue is nothing new. It's been going on for 30 to 40 years. And if we don't do something to address the root causes, it'll continue for the next 20 or 30 years. And it's just not correct for us to ignore the root causes. It doesn't matter how dangerous the trip is from Central America. It doesn't matter how expensive the trip is. And a lot of those families were telling me they paid $15,000 to the smugglers. And it doesn't matter how hard it is to cross the border. These families, if they're hungry, if they fear for their life, they will take the trip north. And of course, our efforts cannot be day to day, month to month, but rather consistent. We're concluding our efforts in Afghanistan, our involvement in that war, 20 years. Iraq, dozens of years. Yet this is our backyard. We need a Marshall Plan. We need to stabilize Central America. That's long term. That's where we need to go. But for today, Madam Chair, if I can, I would like to ask some of our witnesses, Ms. Podlock, some questions. Ms. Podlock, how feasible would it be to provide legal services to these migrant families in Central America?
To provide services for them once they're here and they're asking for protection?
While they're still in Central America.
Yeah, so, the Biden administration has just committed to restarting the Central American Minors Program so that unaccompanied children can ask for refugee status while they're there. And we think it's imperative for those children to understand the process and understand how they tell the story, so our refugee officers can decide whether or not that person qualifies. And so it's very important for them to make sure that they're able to get know your rights information and have an attorney explain to them how they should tell their story in a way that'll make sense to an adjudicator. There are lots of law firms who are willing to provide services pro bono for free, who want to work and help people so that they can apply for protection closer to home. And we want to make sure that we do that, and we still allow people to come to the border and ask for protection and compliance with US law.
And I asked this question of you because I saw in those faces, those children that have had a long trip, very treacherous and dangerous trip. I saw a young lady, 14 years old, that had gotten raped a number of times by a number of men on that trip. And I, as a father, as a human being, want to figure out what's the best way to provide asylum to these refugee seekers so that they don't have to make this treacherous trip through Mexico and Central America. In your opinion, can we come up with a system that we can provide the rights, protect the rights of asylum seekers while they're still at home?
Yes, absolutely. I think expanding the Central American Minors Program to allow children to ask for refugee status closer to their country of origin, closer to home. I think we can do that for families. We already have regional protection mechanisms, and we can expand those so that we can do refugee processing for people while they're still closer to home. They can make decisions. It'll alleviate the burden, some of the pressure at the border, and it'll ensure safety so people don't always have to make a journey to ask for help.
So, ma'am, what can we do as Congress to make sure that we implement this new Biden policy immediately of providing legal access to legal services to refugees in Central America? What can we do?
Sure. So I think appropriating funds to ensure that counsel can be provided and information can be provided. I think funding information campaigns like DHS and HHS have done in the past. I think being supportive of a presidential request for refugees so that when people make those applications, we have the numbers and we're able to support the resettlement for those who are approved.
And would you say,
Mr. Correa, your time has expired.
thank you, Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. And now I will recognize Representative Guest for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. To all of our witnesses here today, I want to thank you for joining us to be part of this discussion on a very important topic for our entire country. I had the chance, along with other members of the Homeland Security Committee, roughly 2 weeks ago to visit the southwest border. We visited the processing center there in Donna, Texas, where we saw at that time 4,000 plus children in a facility that was only designated to hold 250. And so I understand that this is an issue that Congress must address. This is not something that we can turn a blind eye to, and we must begin to address the root causes, how we're going to address this long term, but also how we're going to address this in the immediate future. Ms. Reese, in your written testimony, you speak of the fact that in March there were 19,000 unaccompanied minor children which were taken in there at the border, that this was the largest number ever seen in recorded history. You go on in your report also to talk a little bit about the border crisis of 2019. And so what I want to ask you to do is I want to ask you to contrast the response of the administration, the previous administration, in dealing with the surge that we saw in 2019 versus the response that the current administration is taking to rectify or to intervene in the surge that we're seeing here today. Ms. Reese, I think you're on mute for me.
Sorry about that. The border crisis in 2019, as well as now, involved not only a lot of unaccompanied alien children, but family units. And so after the Trump administration asked Congress to close the loopholes that led to those types of flows, the Trump administration implemented the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico program. This is something that Congress had passed in the 1996 law that said you can come and apply for asylum, but you can wait for those proceedings in Mexico. And when future migrants learned that they could not abuse the asylum system to get into the US and then disappear into the interior, they stopped coming. Those with valid asylum applications obviously then could apply, but it greatly decreased the number, again, preventing fraud. The other key aspect of it was the asylum agreements made with the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and instituting what was called the notion of the safe third country, which is if you're truly fleeing for your life, you should seek protection in the first safe country in which you arrive, not traverse 2-3 countries just to apply for asylum in the US. So it prevented forum shopping. It helped those countries build up their respective asylum systems, which everybody should be for, and enforcing their respective borders.
And Ms. Reese, you're entirely correct. Much of the surge we're seeing today is coming from our Northern Triangle countries, and those immigrants are coming through Mexico. They're not requesting asylum in Mexico. They're being allowed for safe passage through Mexico, and then they're coming in the United States, and there they are requesting asylum. And so you're exactly right. That is something that we are not addressing, that the public is not talking about, is that Mexico is allowing these individuals to pass through, and they're not even attempting to apply for asylum there. You also talked about the Remain in Mexico policy, and I think it is your testimony that you believe this was an effective policy. We've heard from other witnesses that they believe that this policy had no or very little impact would you please talk as far as your opinion, how big of an impact the Remain in Mexico policy had once it was put in place by the administration, and now that that policy has since been withdrawn, what we are seeing as far as the increase in numbers along the southwest border?
Well, it stopped the caravans, which was a very visual sign of the flows of illegal immigrants that were coming here in 2018, 2019. Also, the numbers were in March of this year, 19,000 unaccompanied alien children. In April of 2020, there were 741. So a significant difference in numbers, but it's also not just about the numbers. It is how are the people, what does the U.S. government do with them when they come here? Are they simply being processed more quickly into the U.S. and released, which is a catch and release posture, and it is an extremely strong pull factor for more future illegal immigration? Or are they quickly given an opportunity to seek relief from removal, and they're either granted, or if they're denied, then removed?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I believe my time is up, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. The gentleman yields back. Just for clarification, when we say Remain in Mexico, it's the same as the MPP program that we're referencing. When we talk about concern about cartels, it did exactly that. It put families into the hands of cartels. And with that, we will go back to the chairman of the full committee and see if our audio is okay. Chairman Thompson, the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now, Madam Chair Lady?
We can hear you loud and clear, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mayor, one of the concerns some communities have had about accepting unaccompanied minors in their area. Can you kind of describe for the committee your experience with the unaccompanied minors that have come to Long Beach from the standpoint, are they on drugs, or are there criminal elements? So just describe to the committee what you found.
Absolutely. I think what we have found is that the kids that are arriving are just like any other children that you'd see in our country or anywhere else. Obviously, when they arrive at the border, many of them are frightened. Some, of course, have been through trauma, but they're immediately cared for, and they have the same smiles, the same love, the same needs that any other kid would have. There's no criminal activity. They're actually being treated. We ensure that they're all healthy. And most importantly, they're kids. I mean, right now, as this hearing is going on, we have children that are receiving care. They're receiving a hot meal. They're able to read books. They're playing with each other, and most importantly, the focus is on reuniting their family. And so these are children, regardless of where they're from. And I think it's important for us to take care of them as best possible.
Thank you very much. Now, again, say thanks to you and the people of Long Beach for reaching out, understanding that. Ms. Potkin, can you explain some of the misguided and perhaps unlawful policies that were created during the previous administration that have been done away with by the Biden administration?
Sure, I can start off with talking about Title 42, which eviscerated the ability for children to even ask for help from the United States, right? That was really the most devastating, when the U.S. just slammed the doors in the faces of these kids. So having the Biden administration, first the courts and then the Biden administration say, we're going to go back to complying with the law, complying with the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and allowing children to ask for protection has been most important, so that children are even able to ask for safety right now. Then there's other things that they have done that have been really helpful. So as I mentioned before, allowing for children to ask for protection closer to home to apply for refugee status is incredibly important. And they've also put into place many procedures and expedited procedures to screen and identify the sponsors to get the kids out of government custody so that when they're going through the very complex court process, they're able to do so while living in a home of a family member or a sponsor, so that when they start that very arduous process of going through the court system that we have, they're able to do so outside of government custody.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. Can you explain the importance of having access to counsel while this process is going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to overstate the importance of counsel, especially for a child. I mean, these are children, very, very young in some cases, many of whom do not speak English. And the burden is on them to prove to the government that they have a case, that they have a claim for protection. It's not the government's burden. So you have a kid alone, they have the right to bring an attorney with them, but they're not always given an attorney or given a free attorney. And so it's almost impossible for a kid to go through the system without counsel. In some instances, you have a child who has to go to immigration court. They have to apply for their visa or protection with USCIS. They might need to go to a state court for part of it. So we're talking about 3 different adjudication bodies, and expecting a child to navigate that complex system is next to impossible. So it's crucial kids have it. It's also crucial for our system, right? We want to get it right. We want to get to the bottom of a kid's story and figure out which are the ones that really do need protection and need to stay here. And we can only do that if the child has an attorney.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, seeing no other Republicans at the moment, we will move to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me raise a couple of issues based on what's going on, and I'd like for one of our witnesses, any of the witnesses, to describe what the administration is doing right now in terms of a long-term solution. Maybe I'll ask my own question. Yes, I think, and I've heard it here in the meeting today, that the vice president had not been down to the border, and so she's not working on the issues. And I just wanted to make sure that we all were operating from the same facts, which is that that she was not appointed to work at the border. She's working with the heads of a number of the Central American states, the Triangle, that was brought out earlier. But what I'd like for all of the witnesses to do is, what can you do? What do you think we can do right now as a major step toward dealing with the kids at the border that is both legal and effective?
I'm happy to start. Thanks for that question. I mean, I think this is a really crucial question, because we don't want to be here having the same conversation year after year, having to stand up and flex facilities. I think there's 2 major things. One is really thinking about how we're receiving them, what happens in that moment when the U.S. government first comes into contact with a child, right? And making sure that we're doing it in a humanitarian way, right? So that we have child welfare professionals who are trained experts in talking to children, interviewing children in a trauma-informed way, making sure that we're doing appropriate screening for them, and that we're quickly handing them off to the agency that's tasked with child welfare, ORR. But an ORR has to make sure that they're not caught in this cycle of having to stand up emergency facilities over and over, right? We want children in smaller facilities, in home-based facilities, and in licensed care to make sure there's adequate standards and adequate oversight, only until the child can be reunified, right? And then we have to make sure our justice system can support efficient and quick adjudications so that the children's cases are resolved. We don't want a child to have to wait for years to find out what's going to happen to them. So I think if we're able to really think about this system reimagine the reception, make sure we have a more agile ORR system and government care until the kids can get to the system, and then adequately resource our judicial system so that we can decide the kids' cases. It'll be much more efficient, it'll be much more fair, we won't be here again in the long term.
Thank you very much. Since I'm appreciate very much your response. I spoke to a judge here who was a state judge in state courts here in Missouri, and then after he retired, he became one of the judges down the border. I don't think we call them judges, but anyway, that's essentially what it was. And so he requested a meeting with me to tell me what he thought was needed. And he said that he believed that right now that there was a need for approximately another 100 to 200 judges, so that when people come to the system, that a judge has time to listen to their story. And he said, because what's happening is that it's an assembly line, a judicial assembly line, because they don't have the time, and they have so many people, and they know that they have to get individual after individual in and out. That he said he is absolutely certain that they make mistakes. Do you see that as one of the top 5 moves that we should make?
I think an adequately resourced judicial system is very important. Now, for unaccompanied children, when they're making applications for relief, those actually go to USCIS. So we also need to make sure that the Department of Justice is allowing the immigration judges to manage their dockets in a way where they say, this child doesn't need to keep coming before me because I'm waiting for my colleagues over here at DHS to decide on their visa application. So I'm just going to put this child's case on hold until DHS can do it. That way judges can conserve their resources so that even though we do need to hire more, if they can manage their own dockets and have a little bit more flexibility than they did before the Trump administration, I think we'll see a lot of efficiencies realized that way as well.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the questions, and the gentleman looks back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I sincerely believe that there are some people who see the solution as just keep the problem on the other side of the border. As long as they're over there, doesn't matter what the circumstance happens to be in the city that they're in, just keep it on the other side of the border. I'm not one of them. We have a humanitarian crisis in Triangle, as we're calling it, but in Central America. And we have to do something about it. I just don't believe that the solution is fence them out. Someone drops a baby over the border. I don't think they will say toss the baby back, but there seems to be a belief that the baby shouldn't have fallen over. I'm not one of those people. I want to help the people in Central America. My belief is that President Biden has a good idea to fund a plan to help stabilize Central America and possibly to help other countries as well. Mexico should be helped. They've taken on a huge amount of responsibility when persons were just getting to the wall, stacking up. Mexico doesn't have a better economic order than we have, but we were perfectly content to just let them stay on the other side of the wall in Mexico. I'm not one of those people. So now, regardless of what happens to me, I believe the Good Samaritan asked the question, what's going to happen to that person if I don't help? Not what's going to happen to me if I try to help. So let me just ask you this, Ms. Potku. Ma'am, These mothers, fathers, they know that what they're paying to have their children crumb thousands of dollars is too much. They know they shouldn't put their children in the hand of a stranger, yet they do it. They know of the dangers along the way, yet they send them. My assumption is that you have talked to some of these children. What do the children tell you? Their parents tell them when they embrace them for the last time and say, be on your way. I'll come and get you at some point, but you need to go now. What do they tell their children?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I'm a parent myself, and so being in that position is completely unimaginable, having to make those kinds of decisions. And I think what's remarkable is that we think about, we're sometimes sit in a place of judgment and really trying to put ourselves in their shoes about how difficult that must be. And, a parent would only ever do that if they felt that, even though they know it's so dangerous and there's so many things that could happen to their child, if what's happening to them in that moment is worse, right, than the risks that they would send their child on. So no parent makes that decision lightly. And I will also say, talking to these children, a lot of times children are making the decision on their own to protect their families, right? I spoke to an 11-year-old once who the gang started to recruit him, and he was worried that they were going to harm his younger siblings because to try to convince him to join the gang. So he left without even telling his mother. And that's what broke his heart the most, is that he didn't get to say goodbye to her, but he did it to protect her and to protect his younger siblings. And he was only 11.
Well, I was at the border, and I think the child was 5 years old, screaming for her older brother that traversed this distance with her. When the brother arrived, the brother was 8 years old, 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. This is not just about numbers, thousands of children showing up at the border. This is about children and about decency and about who we are as a country. So either we are going to have a heart and say to people, we will help because we know you need help. It's not as though they don't need it. They're not faking it. Our intelligence tells us that they need it. I thank you for your answer, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. And now we will recognize the gentlewoman from New York. Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, thank you, Chairwoman Barragan and Ranking Member Higgins, for holding this timely hearing today and to address the issue of unaccompanied minors at the border. And I thank all of our witnesses for appearing before us, albeit virtually today. We are in a critical moment to address the impact of what I believe was a cruel and ineffective immigration policy of the Trump administration. Policies that ripped thousands of kids from their parents, leaving many still not yet reunited with their loved ones. It is time that we assess the current state of U.S. immigration policies and support the Biden administration's efforts to increase capacity to shelter these unaccompanied children in a humane way. With that, I will now move on to my questions. Ms. Podko, migration trends at the southern border have changed dramatically over the last decade, yet it still appears that our border policies are outdated, as they are originally developed with single adults in mind instead of unaccompanied minors. What immediate actions should DHS, HHS, and Congress take to resolve the gaps that exist between our border policies and our recent migration trends?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I think there's a few things that could be done immediately. I think ensuring that Customs and Border Protection hires child welfare professionals, right, to care for and screen the children that they're encountering, right? We want to make sure that we have trained professionals engaging with them, and so we can get our law enforcement agents back out doing law enforcement work and not taking care of children. We also think that there would be a lot of efficiencies realized if Health and Human Services could be co-located in Customs and Border facilities where children are being held and screened, because right immediately then HHS officials could be starting to consider extended family members as potential sponsors so that children may even not even have to go to ORR custody. They could really identify what is going to be the best placing if they do have to send a child to government custody, where would that be, so that they can get the child to a sponsor right away, and that you're not losing any time when you're starting to identify and screen a sponsor. I think the other thing too is ensuring that the government is funding counsel for children. As I said before, we're gonna see a lot of efficiencies in the judicial system if kids are represented, because they'll understand how to go through the process, and we can make sure they know how to comply with the entire court process, and we can get to the bottom of their story.
And these were great suggestions. I think they're common sense suggestions, but what should be done over the longer term in your estimation?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of people have talked about how do we address these root causes, right? That's a long-term solution, right? I think these are going to take time, but it's important to start the investments now and show these countries that we're serious and really focus our fiscal support and training support and educational support to these countries on really addressing issues of child adversity, right? What is it that's making these kids leave in the first place, and really focus our aid and support to those kinds of solutions. And then I think also ORR, they're struggling right now with the numbers of kids being referred to them by CBP. So there's kind of the short term trying to open up the facilities like the mayor is running. But what they need to do is really pivot in the long term and think about how can we make sure that we don't have to rely on these kinds of facilities. So making sure that they're matching what Congress has already said for the domestic child welfare system is appropriate, not large congregate care, put kids in homes, put them in smaller group homes, make sure that ORR is mimicking that for this population of kids so that we're treating all children the same and we're getting kids to family members and sponsors as quickly as possible.
And would you talk to the sort of the plight of the black migrant that was seeking asylum? Can you speak to how Trump-era border policies such as family separation and Title 42 disproportionately affect Black migrants and their children, and what should be done to address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think we're spending a lot of time talking about Central American children, right? We're serving kids who are coming from Africa, who are coming from Caribbean countries, from all over the world, right? And so there are a lot of Black migrants who are being disproportionately affected, both because it's because of their race that they're being targeted and felt like they had to leave in the first place. But then also, for example, Title 42, right? The way it affected Haitian asylum seekers and Haitian families has been terrible. They weren't able to be put in MPP, right? So they were part of the unwinding of MPP. But then also deportation flights were continuing at a time when there was incredible instability in Haiti. And so I think we really need to take a close look at that and think about how do we make sure that our policies are not discriminatory, and that we're also taking into account discrimination based on race, and how can we make sure that we're protecting those individuals.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. We'll have a second round of questioning, and I will recognize myself for questions. Mr. Reichlin Melnick, we've heard during today's testimony a number of arguments that are being made about the TVPRA causing increase in migration, being these pull factors. We're hearing about these arguments, the Flores Agreement is a cause for increase, and there's been expansion. What's your response to those arguments?
I think you hear a lot about push factors and pull factors, and it's important to note that the push factors are the why people are leaving, whereas the pull factors are often why now. For people in emergency situations, they have to leave immediately. And we saw for years that Central American minors in particular were affected by the violence in those countries. Honduras and El Salvador were two of the most violent countries in the world. And in fact, we've seen when violence has dropped in El Salvador over the last few years, fewer unaccompanied children are coming to our borders, making clear that this is a direct result of instability in people's home countries. As for Flores, there is no evidence whatsoever that the Flores settlement agreement's change had any impact on unaccompanied children. Similarly, unaccompanied children were exempt from the Remain in Mexico or MPP program. Title 42 was the first and only program at the border specifically targeting unaccompanied children, and yet the number of unaccompanied children coming to our borders rose every single month while Title 42 was in place, even as the Trump administration was expelling thousands of children back to their home countries.
Thank you. Mayor Garcia, it has been really amazing to kind of see the reception from our community in the accepting these children that are fleeing violence. Can you talk a little bit about how you have received, let me back up a little. Have you received much outreach from nonprofits or community organizations that want to help? And can you also help describe what the community's reception has been to establishing this emergency facility in Long Beach?
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming response has been really positive. Obviously, there is a huge amount of overwhelming support as it relates to assisting the children. I think for most folks in our community, this is not a political issue. This is about helping kids, about being compassionate, about being kind. We've already, in just a few days, have received thousands of books and toys that have been donated by the community. We have community groups that have assisted to volunteer. We've had a lot of folks just come in and just really want to help. Obviously, there is also a lot of conversation. Like any effort, there's a conversation about the future of immigration policy. There's a lot of folks in our community that want immigration reform done now, and our shelter is not a substitute for strong immigration policy, and that's something that we have heard and that I support. But the support has been really strong, and that's evident in both the council's unanimous vote, but also vast majority of the messages we've received have been overwhelmingly positive.
Well, thank you. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, one of the things that really struck me in your testimony, which I went through and starred when I was reading it, was this concept that unaccompanied children generally win their cases in immigration court, or they're allowed to stay in the United States. I represented a child from Guatemala, and while asylum may be hard, there are things like withholding of removal, and that child got to stay here. Can you, is there anything that you want to share with this committee, or, combat some of the myths out there that we keep hearing, drowning out what's really happening and the dire conditions of these children that are coming legally to seek a refuge here and asylum here to protections?
Thank you for the opportunity. So I think the first thing I want to make clear is that seeking asylum is legal. Right now, the only way for families and unaccompanied children to seek asylum is to cross between ports of entry, because the ports of entry remain closed to all those seeking asylum, even at a time when 340,000 people cross at legal ports of entry every day, going from Mexico into the United States for traffic, shopping, or whatever. And importantly, when you actually look at long-term outcomes of unaccompanied children's cases, over the last few years, since 2013, most children did end up winning their cases or being granted the right to stay. And when we talk about families and other asylum seekers, the previous administration often made false claims that those people wouldn't show up in court. But a study done by the American Immigration Council that looked at 2.8 million hearings from 2008 to 2018 found immigrants appear overwhelmingly 83% of the case. And those few that miss their hearings usually miss their hearings because of government error and not because they are intentionally failing to appear. So that's why we need to access case management services that help people go through a confusing court process and not simply say that those few who do miss court are somehow bad actors. People know that if they want to have a chance at staying in the United States legally, they have to go through a process. And we should make sure that process is easier to go through so that people don't fall through the cracks through no fault of their own.
Thank you. My time has expired. I will now move on to Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. To any of the witnesses in particular, just one question I had deals with reunification. I know we've talked about reunification being the goal of the unaccompanied minors who come into the country. For those individuals that do not have family members in the United States, what should our long-term policy be as far as placement of these children?
I can start with so for traditionally about 10% of the unaccompanied children don't have anyone, any family member, anyone who's able to sponsor them when they arrive. So what happens is they stay in government custody through the duration of their case. So at the end of their case, they either win their case. If they win legal status, they're eligible for the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, which is a federal foster care program where they can stay until they're 21 because they have their green card and they'll be on their path to citizenship. If they lose their case, then they're removed by the government, just like anyone else would be removed by ICE.
And let me ask you, Jennifer, I think maybe you told the story about the 11-year-old child who came to the United States without even consulting with his family. Assuming that he had family in his home country who wanted him back, who wanted to care for him and love for him and allow him to live in their home, should that be taken into consideration as to where the best placement for the child is? I'm thinking of many times as we deal with minor children here in the United States, and we're looking at things such as custody and what parents should get custody and where the best place for the children to grow up. And often here in our Chancery or Family Law Court, we talk about reunification, placing them back with parents, with grandparents, with aunts and uncles. Are those matters taken into consideration? And if not, should they not be taken into consideration as to where there are close family members where these children can reside and live in those homes?
That's a great question. And, we don't have the consideration of the best interest of the child in U.S. law. Right? So there's different elements, in some forms of relief and some considerations, you can talk about what might be in that child's best interest, but there really isn't a legal standard here that we're applying in our U.S. immigration system for these children, right? And we think it's very important, right? Just like you do, that we're taking into account all the considerations about this child's life and what's really going to be in their best interest. I also think it's important, we were talking about why aren't people asking for protection in Mexico, right? Mexico has a law in which they're required to consider the best interest of the child, right? And it's important for the Mexican government to be able to talk to the US government and say, hey, for example, we have a child here in Mexico who's considering applying for asylum, but their mom lives in Chicago, right? Should we, if they have support there, is the child eventually going to want to end up with her? Does it make more sense for the U.S. to adjudicate this application for asylum? And so I think it's really important, not just for the U.S. to consider the best interest of the child, but for us to be talking about it in a regional way with countries in the region to make sure that we're doing right by these kids and families.
And would you agree that should be, I know it is not, but it should be one of the things that the court should look at as the best interest of the child, whether that child remain in the United States, whether that child live in Mexico with family members or return back to their country of origin? Should that not be at least one of the factors that the court addresses as we are dealing with unaccompanied minors who in some cases would have to go into some sort of foster care family or foster care system here versus being able to return to family members who would like them to be in their homes in other countries?
Yeah, there are so many factors that need to be taken into account, and most important is where that child would be the safest, right? So it's who can care for them, where does the family live, and where would they be most safe? Those should all certainly be things that the government considers.
So you would say that should be a factor we should consider?
Where they have family, yeah, where they have family, where they have support system, absolutely. But the priority also has to be, which is already under U.S. law, where they're going to be safe, right? So we can't
and can people be safe outside the United States? And I understand we may not return them to their country of origin, but if they had family in Mexico or they had family somewhere else and those family members wanted those children, should that not be taken into consideration? It seems to me the argument has been that everyone who comes into the United States, regardless of where they're going to be placed, should remain here. And I believe that many should, but I also believe that there are certain circumstances where you have family members, particularly the 11-year-old boy who left his family. I think those parents should have some say. If my child left at 11, as a parent, I have legal rights in the United States that my child can't make that decision. As a parent, I get to be involved. And it seems to me that should be something that we should have in our court system. And it seems to be something that is lacking and has not been part of the conversation. Madam Chairman, I know I'm out of time, so at this time I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. You raised an interesting point that, frankly, I've been to the border many, many times. I've spoken to family members, and I don't generally see a situation. It's quite opposite. It's where the parents are sending the kids because of the violence, because they've already lost a kid, or because they're trying to protect them. And also the number of family members that we have that actually have come and sponsor a child, that number is very high of kids who have family in the United States. But Thanks so much for your questioning and for the points that you've made. I will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I've been to the border and I've also been across the border. I had a constituent, Mr. Escobar. He was reporting to ICE. He reported pursuant to agreements, and he had his American-born wife and American-born child with him. He was removed from his family without the kind of notice that we would like to have. And he was sent to El Salvador, San Salvador, with the clothes on his back and about $20 in his pocket. It took us more than 2 years, I believe, to get him home. But in the process, I went there to see him. And I went to San Salvador and I went to a repatriation center. And one of the things that concerned them greatly was when people are brought back into the country, there are literally people who will wait for them, waylay them, harm them. It's really not a pretty picture when you have an opportunity to see it up close and how these people are fearful of leaving the repatriation center. I believe one of our speakers, Mr. Is it Melnick? Sir, you talked about the harm. I want you to just revisit that. There are some things that bear repeating. Tell us about what can happen to people when we send them back to harm's way.
Thank you very much for that question. We saw the problems this caused in particular under the Remain in Mexico program and continue to occur under Title 42 when people were sent back to Mexico. Multiple people, hundreds if not thousands of people, were kidnapped within minutes or hours after they were sent back to Mexico, sometimes right after their court hearings. When Congress held a hearing on MPP 2 years ago, we submitted a statement for the record about one mother who had crossed the border for a court hearing with her 7-year-old nonverbal disabled child. After asking not to be sent back to Mexico because of the danger, the previous administration ignored her pleas and sent her back to Mexico, and within 5 minutes, she was kidnapped at knife point, held, assaulted with her and her daughter, and ultimately ended up ordered deported for missing a court hearing because she was in the hands of her kidnappers when that court hearing was scheduled to occur. Even today, the cartels station people outside the ports of entry waiting for the US to send people back. As you said, this occurs in San Salvador as well, but it is most particularly egregious in Mexico, right at the border. And the State Department says that the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, where many people are returned, is a level 4 security risk comparable to Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan, where no one should go. And yet we are still sending families back there every single day. We have to keep those risks in mind when we talk about sending people back and making them wait in Mexico, because as we know, those situations are not safe, especially for migrants and especially for Black migrants who are particularly at risk in Mexico, where there is often frequent discrimination against them.
With reference to the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, sir, Mr. Escobar, he had to stay at home most of the time. He was accosted when he left. Now, mind you, he was dropped off at the airport, hadn't been to El Salvador in 15 years. Dropped off at the airport, just a few dollars in his pocket. He and some others had to get together, pool their resources, and try to get a vehicle to get them outside of the city to a safe place before it got too dark. They had to literally try to escape from the airport to avoid harm. This is not a pretty picture. You have to actually see the people and how they fear for their lives to appreciate what's happening to them. There is a lot of fear, and my hope is that what you've said will have some meaning to us about just sending people back to harm's way. And I appreciate your commentary. And Madam Chair, I thank you for the second opportunity. I just pray that this will have a better ending than it seems that we're headed toward. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Green, for sharing with us and for yielding back. That's all we have for questions from members. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond in writing. Without objection, the committee record should be kept open for 10 days. Now, I also want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record letters from CHIRLA, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Catholic Charities, Amnesty International, First Focus on Children, and Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. They submitted testimony. Hearing no objection, we will include those as well. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.